Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
We have done several episodes about witch trials that took place in Europe and North America during the early modern period, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries. So that includes our episodes on the Varda witch trials of Norway in 1621, Matthew Hopkins, who framed himself as Witchfinder General in East Anglia in the 1640s, and the trial of Goody Garlick on Long Island in 1657. There are some really old episodes by prior hosts on the infamous Salem witch trials that started in 1692 as well. And of course, there is our very recent episode on Alice Kittler involving the first person to be burned at the stake for witchcraft in Ireland in 1324. So that was really centuries before these kinds of trials really peaked. We also have a past episode about someone who was tried for both witchcraft and lycanthropy. That was Gilles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole, who was convicted in 1573. We are talking about another convicted werewolf today. That is Peter Stumpp, or Peter Stumpp, also known as the Werewolf of Bedburg. And these two, Peter Stumpp and Gilles Garnier, they were not isolated cases. The concepts of witchcraft and lycanthropy were interconnected during this period. Cultures all around the world have stories and legends and folklore about people who can shapeshift into animals or animals that take on human form. This episode is not a remotely comprehensive overview of this kind of shapeshifting or even of werewolves in general. This is just focused on Western Europe, specifically in what is now Germany and the surrounding area in the early modern period. Also, this episode is grisly and disturbing. The charges against Peter Stumpp included things like gruesome murders and cannibalism and incest and rape, among other things. If there's anything that you might want to be warned about, it's probably in here, honestly.
Spiders?
There's no spiders. I exactly was thinking spiders, and I was like, there's no spiders. No snakes either.
Our arachnophobes are safe. But what we are going to start with is wolves. Today in Europe and North America, it is extremely rare for a person to be attacked by a wolf, especially in the wild. The biggest exceptions involve sick wolves, including rabid wolves, and attacks involving people who are out with their dogs. The dogs are really what the wolf is seeing as prey, not the person. Wolves can sometimes prey on livestock, but they prefer wild animals like deer and elk, and the very large majority of livestock deaths in these parts of the world are not predator-related. But none of that was true in early modern Europe. Wolf attacks on livestock and on people, especially children, were a much bigger issue. We talked about this a little bit in our episode on the Beast of Gévaudan, which was about a series of animal attacks in 18th century France, and we ran that as a Saturday classic in October of 2019.
There is some speculation about why wolves seem to have been a bigger threat to humans during the early modern period, even when they didn't have rabies or some kind of other disease affecting their behavior. One is the period of regional cooling known as the Little Ice Age, which was well underway by the start of the 16th century. This led to longer winters and cooler temperatures in some parts of the world, including parts of Europe. So wolves' usual food sources might have been more scarce, leading them to feed on more livestock, which put them into closer contact with humans.
Another possibility is warfare, with wolves scavenging bodies from battlefields. This isn't about developing a so-called taste for human flesh, but about wolves becoming more habituated to people and human environments. In today's world, at least in North America, we see this kind of habituation more with bears, when people either feed bears on purpose or don't take steps to keep their food and garbage away from bears. But it is the same basic idea. wolves starting to see humans as potential food sources rather than as something to stay away from, eventually leading to confrontations between the two. In a world where wolf attacks were more common, people were also more focused on them and worried about them, which probably led to a perception that they were even more frequent than they really were.
Like I said at the top of the show, there are stories of people turning into or being turned into various animals, including wolves, all across legends and folklore all around the world. Other ideas that were related to that but a little more disconnected are things like Germanic and Norse peoples wearing wolf skins in battle with the idea that they would bestow a wolf-like ferocity on them. In medieval Europe, those kinds of ideas, combined with the fear of wolves and wolf attacks and all of that, coalesced into the idea of the werewolf.
A werewolf was not just a person who could transform into a wolf, but someone who became a wolf and then did monstrous things. Sometimes these monstrous deeds were carried out only when they were transformed, but it could be all of the time, regardless of whether they were in the shape of a wolf or a human. If a community started experiencing a lot of livestock deaths or animal attacks, people might blame a werewolf for them, not just a regular wolf. Werewolves were associated not just with gruesome attacks on people and animals, but also with other crimes like rape and cannibalism, and with sins like gluttony and lust.
And wolves were also connected to the idea of witchcraft. There were stories about witches enchanting wolves so that they could ride them or use them as beasts of burden, and stories about witches transforming themselves or other witches into wolves for that same reason. But that kind of transformation wasn't quite the same thing as being a werewolf. A witch was someone who was believed to be using magic to harm people, and similarly, a werewolf was someone who was believed to be transforming into a wolf in order to do harm. So, witches only became werewolves if they were hurting people while they were transformed, not if they were just kind of running around in wolf form or carrying other witches on their backs.
Most of the time, people who were accused of witchcraft were women, but people who were accused of lycanthropy or lycanthropy and witchcraft together were more likely to be men. One notable exception is the she-wolves of Julich, who were described in a broadsheet by George Kress of Augsburg. This broadsheet said there were 300 female werewolves in what is now northwestern Germany, who terrorized and slaughtered men and boys until 85 of them were captured and burned at the stake on May 6, 1591. No records of this trial have been unearthed, and there are no individual women named in the broadsheet, so it is possible this was fictionalized or heavily embellished based on a smaller incident. We're going to return to the idea of sensationalized broadsheets later.
Generally speaking, while there were people who criticized these ideas and dismissed witchcraft as superstition or nonsense, a lot of people in this time and place did believe that witches and witchcraft were real. There were manuals about how to identify witches and extract their confessions and execute them, and they took for granted that witchcraft was a real phenomenon. But there was more debate about werewolves. One idea was that witches really were doing nefarious magic, but werewolves were a delusion brought on either by the witch or by the devil. So a person was deluded into believing that he could turn into a wolf, or the people of a community were deluded into believing that there was a werewolf in their midst.
Other accounts treated lycanthropy as a real phenomenon, and there were some common themes among them. Often, a magical item caused the transformation, usually either a belt or a girdle or an unguent. A few accounts describe the skin of a wolf being used for this purpose. Most of the time, whatever it was came from a man in black or from a demon or even the devil himself, who gave someone the object or the knowledge of how to make it. Sometimes this was a gift or something that was part of a bargain, and sometimes it was a curse. Or sometimes the person thought it was going to help them, but then it turned out to be more of a curse.
These intersecting ideas of witchcraft and lycanthropy led to werewolf trials that were very similar to the witch trials that were happening at the same time in the same regions of the world. And they're sometimes framed as werewolf witch trials. For example, in Besançon, France in 1521, shepherds Pierre Bourgault and Michel Verdun claimed to have made a pact with demons for food and money and protection for their flocks. In exchange, they said they were given an ointment that would turn them into wolves and were made to hunt and eat children. They were both convicted and burned at the stake. Gilles Garnier, who we covered on the show before, was found guilty of both lycanthropy and witchcraft in 1573 after a series of killings in Dole, France, and they were similarly burned to death. Henri Bouget, who was Grand Judge of the Saint-Claude region of Franche-Comté in what's now eastern France, carried out a whole series of trials for witchcraft and lycanthropy in the 1590s, and he sentenced the convicted werewolves to being burned alive.
Peter Stumpp's conviction for lycanthropy took place in what is now Germany in 1589, and we're going to get into that after we pause for a sponsor break.
We don't really know much about Peter Stumpp, since various 16th century accounts of him do exist, but they really don't go beyond the werewolf stuff. There's no birth record for him or records of life outside of this context. There are also a lot of different spellings of his name, which isn't really unusual for the time, especially considering that some of these documents only survive as translations. In the words of Montague Summers in his 1933 book, The Werewolf, quote, "One of the most famous of all German werewolf trials was that of Peter Stumpp, or Stumpf, Stube, Stubbe, Stub, as the name is indifferently spelled, and there are other variants. He was executed for his horrible crimes at Bedburg near Cologne on 31st March, 1590. I don't know where Montague Summers got that date of March 31st, 1590. Most other sources say this was in October of 1589. Some of them specifically say October 31st, 1589, and that includes something that Summers reprints in his book immediately after saying that it was in March.
Some version of Stumpp may or may not have even been this man's actual surname. A broadsheet that was published in Nuremberg in 1589 does not name the perpetrator, but is clearly about this story. It describes a farmer who had a belt that let him turn into a wolf. He attacked another farmer while in wolf form, and that farmer fought back, cutting off the wolf's paw. The wolf fled, and when the farmer told a neighbor about what had happened, he pulled out the paw as evidence he was telling the truth. But the paw had transformed into a human hand. When the werewolf was apprehended in his human form, his missing hand became part of the evidence against him. Various sources draw a connection between the missing hand and the name Stumpp, but some accounts of this don't mention a missing hand at all.
Today, the longest and most detailed contemporary account of this is a true discourse declaring the damnable life and death of one Stubbe Peter, a most wicked sorcerer, who in the likeness of a wolf committed many murders, continuing this devilish practice 25 years, killing and devouring men, women, and children, who for the same fact was taken and executed the 31st of October last past in the town of Bedburg, near the city of Cologne in Germany. This document was translated from High Dutch, meaning German, and printed in 1590. And there are no known copies of the original German text today. It's the same one that Montague Summers reprinted in its entirety in his werewolf book.
We are going to tell Peter's story as it was described in this text and point out some moments where other accounts have different details. The pamphlet describes Stubbe Peter as growing up around Bedburg, which is west of Cologne. From his youth, he was, quote, greatly inclined to evil and the practicing of wicked arts, even from 12 years of age till 20, and so forwards till his dying day. Peter wanted magic, necromancy, and sorcery, so he acquainted himself with, quote, many infernal spirits and fiends, insomuch that forgetting the God that made him, and that Savior that shed his blood for man's redemption. In the end, careless of salvation, gave both soul and body to the devil forever, for small carnal pleasure in this life, that he might be famous and spoken of on earth, though he lost heaven thereby.
The devil had a ready ear for, quote, the lewd motions of cursed men. So the devil promised to give Peter whatever his heart desired during his mortal life. Peter desired neither riches nor external outward pleasure, but, quote, having a tyrannous heart and a most cruel, bloody mind, he only requested that at his pleasure he might work his malice on men, women, and children in the shape of some beast, whereby he might hew without dread or danger of life, and unknown to be the executor of any bloody enterprise which he meant to commit.
The devil saw Peter as, quote, a fit instrument to perform mischief as a wicked fiend pleased with the desire of wrong and destruction. So the devil gave Peter a girdle that would turn him into, quote, a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like unto brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body and mighty paws. When Peter removed the girdle, he would go back to his human form, as though nothing had happened.
This account describes Peter as very happy about this development, since he was already inclined to blood and cruelty. He, quote, proceeded to the execution of sundry most heinous and vile murders, for if any person displeased him, he would incontinent thirst for revenge, and no sooner should they or any of theirs walk abroad in the fields or about the city, but in the shape of a wolf he would presently encounter them and never rest until he had plucked out their throats and tear their joints asunder.
Peter had already been prone to cruelty and violence, and being given this girdle fed those tendencies. So over time, he developed a real lust for blood. He would also put on a, quote, comely habit and walk through the towns where the friends and relatives of his victims lived. He would observe them and also pick out people who appealed to him so he could stalk and murder them later. This included finding attractive women who he would rape before killing them.
This account of Peter's life as a werewolf is truly horrifying. Quote, thus continuing his devilish and damnable deeds within the compass of few years, he had murdered 13 young children and 2 goodly young women big with child, tearing the children out of their wombs in most bloody and savage sort, and after eat their hearts, panting hot and raw, which he accounted dainty morsels and best agreeing to his appetite. Moreover, he used many times to kill lambs and kids and such like beasts, feeding on the same most usually raw and bloody, as if he had been a natural wolf indeed, so that all men mistrusted nothing less than his devilish sorcery.
Peter also committed incest with his daughter Baillie, who he fathered when he was, quote, not altogether so wickedly given. She was thought of as beautiful and graceful and commended by all who knew her. Baillie had a child as a result of this assault. Peter also committed incest with his sister, and he had a relationship with a woman named Catherine Trompin, who is described as his gossip. At the time, the word gossip had several meanings that it does not today, including godparent, godchild, and chummy friend. And one broadsheet describes Catherine as Peter's godmother. Catherine Trompin is described as, quote, a woman of tall and comely stature, of exceeding good favor, and one that was well esteemed among her neighbors. And for 7 years, Peter also kept company with a, quote, she-devil, a wicked spirit in the form of a beautiful woman sent by the devil who knew that Peter would not be able to resist her.
Multiple 16th century documents describe Peter Stumpp by various spellings as living as a werewolf for about 25 years, during which time he killed 16 people, 13 of them children, as well as various livestock. Some accounts say the adults were 2 women and a man, and others say they were 2 men and a woman. But when he put on that comely habit and appeared around town, people were not suspicious of him. We'll talk about how he was eventually apprehended after a sponsor break. In addition to his daughter Beale, Peter Stumpp had a son. It's not clear who the son's mother was from the accounts that I read, but Peter is described as calling this boy, quote, his heart's ease. Peter seemed to take more delight in his son than in almost anything else, but that anything else was violence, rape, and murder. One day, father and son were walking in the woods together, and the son went ahead to answer the call of nature. While he was gone, Peter turned into a wolf, and then he encountered his son again while he was still in wolf form. Peter was insensible and killed his son and ate his brain.
Then one day, Peter was in his wolf form and came upon some children who were playing in a meadow near some cattle. Peter attacked one of the little girls, trying to grab her by the neck and drag her away. But she was wearing a coat with a very high, stiff collar, and he couldn't bite through it. She started screaming, and the cattle stampeded, thinking the wolf was trying to take one of their calves. The little girl escaped, and the stampeding cattle drove Peter away.
This little girl was related to Meester Thijs Artien, a brewer who lived in London and had already gotten some letters from other people around Bedburg about the murders and livestock killings there. Family wrote to him about this attack as well. Other people in London and people living elsewhere in Germany had also heard about the deaths of people and livestock around Bedburg and about various unsuccessful efforts to try to catch the culprit, keep everyone safe. This included people raising mastiffs and other large dogs to try to protect themselves. The assault on the children who were out with the cattle led to a bigger hunt for the culprit.
A true discourse declaring the damnable life and death of one Stubbe Peter presents the turning point in this search as the moment that God allowed some hunters to see Peter in the act of removing his girdle and changing from a wolf to a nicely dressed man, carrying a walking stick as he made his way to town. The hunters walked home with him to make sure he was a real person and not a delusion or some other fantastical occurrence. And once they were sure that Peter was real, they captured him and took him before the magistrates.
Peter was put to the rack. That's the torture device that slowly pulled a person by their wrists and ankles until their joints dislocated. Some accounts make it sound like he confessed under torture, but a true discourse declaring the damnable life and death of one Stubbe Peter describes him as fearing torture and voluntarily confessing his whole life, including all the murders and getting the werewolf girdle from the devil, seemingly before actually being tortured.
Peter was condemned to death for these crimes. His daughter Beale, who you'll recall was a victim of incest, and his gossip, Catherine Trompkin, were both found to be accessories to the murders. Judgment was pronounced on all three of them on October 28th, 1589.
In the words of the true discourse, quote, Stubbe Peter, as principal malefactor, was judged first to have his body laid on a wheel, and with red-hot burning pincers in 10 several places to have the flesh pulled off from the bones. After that, his legs and arms to be broken with a wooden axe or hatchet. Afterward, to have his head struck from his body. Then to have his carcass burned to ashes. Also, his daughter and his gossip were judged to be burned quick to ashes, the same time and day with the carcass of the aforesaid Stubbe Peter. And on the 31st of the same month, they suffered death accordingly in the town of Bedburg in the presence of many peers and princes of Germany.
Afterward, a tall pole was erected in the town of Bedburg, with the wheel Peter had been broken on mounted horizontally at the top. On top of the wheel was a wooden likeness of a wolf, and above that was Peter Stumpp's head. 16 pieces of wood were hung around the edges of the wheel for the 16 people that he had confessed to killing.
This kind of monument was, of course, partly a warning to other werewolves, and the true discourse described itself as, quote, a warning to all sorcerers and witches, which unlawfully follow their own devilish imagination to the utter mine and destruction of their souls eternally, from which wicked and damnable practice. Elsewhere, this document says it is, quote, published for example's sake, and lastly, to censure thereof, as reason and wisdom doth think convenient, considering the subtlety that Satan useth to work the soul's destruction. 4 people witnessed to the document as true. Those were Ty Sartine, William Brewer, Adolf State, and George Borres, quote, with diverse others that have seen the same.
Multiple broadsheets and pamphlets relating this story and illustrated with woodcuts were printed in Germany in 1589 and 1590. A lot of them share the same basic details about a werewolf near Bedburg who killed 16 people and committed incest with his daughter, and whose execution involved a wheel, hot pincers, and beheading. Some of the broadsheets used the same woodcut illustration, which focused mainly on the execution, including Peter, Beale, and Catherine being burned at the stake, and showing the pole topped with the wheel, a model of a wolf, and Peter's head. In addition to being published around Germany, these were translated into other languages and printed in other parts of Europe, including the English translation of the True Discourse that we have been reading from.
These pamphlets and woodcuts were connected to the witchcraft and lycanthropy trials that were happening across Europe more broadly. Johannes Gutenberg had developed his movable type printing press in what's now Germany in the mid-15th century. While this was not the world's first printing press or the world's first use of movable type, it had a dramatic impact on print culture in Europe. It became so much easier to print and distribute broadsheets and woodcuts like these.
Since these works were made to be sold, they were often heavily sensationalized and they leaned into people's fears. They also incorporated moralistic themes, like associating werewolves with carnality and lust. The she-wolves of Julich broadsheet that we talked about earlier framed the she-wolves as bad mothers and by extension as bad women, since one of them had a son who was able to find and use her werewolf belt, and she left him alone while she ran around in wolf form.
In addition to the broadsheets about Stubbe Peter, by many similar names, and other purported werewolves and witches, there were also books and broadsheets about how to identify and hunt them. These all fed into each other, with reports of witches and werewolves leading to new broadsheets describing gruesome crimes and grisly executions, and those broadsheets and other print materials circling back to reinforce the idea that witchcraft and lycanthropy were ongoing threats. Broadsheets also reinforced the idea of what witches and werewolves looked like and what kinds of crimes they committed and how they could be identified and how they could be executed to make sure that they would not be supernaturally returned to life.
The story of Peter Stumpp appeared in other contexts as well. For example, Richard Rowlands, also known as Richard Verstegen, published an etymological dictionary called A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence in 1605. Here's its definition of the word werewolf. Quote, "The werewolves are certain sorcerers who, having anointed their bodies with an ointment which they make by the instinct of the devil, and putting on a certain enchanted girdle, do not only unto the view of others seem as wolves, but to their own thinking have both the shape and nature of wolves, so long as they wear the said girdle. And they do dispose themselves as very wolves in worrying and killing and most of human creatures. Of such sundry have been taken and executed in sundry parts of Germany and the Netherlands. One Peter Stumpp, for being a werewolf and having killed 13 children, 2 women, and 1 man, was at Bedburg not far from Cullen in the year 1589, put unto a very terrible death. The flesh of divers parts of his body was pulled out with hot iron tongs, his arms, thighs, and legs broke on a wheel, and his body lastly burnt. He died with very great remorse, desiring that his body might not be spared from any torment, so his soul might be saved. The werewolf, so called in Germany, is in France called loup-garou. For centuries after this, Peter Stumpp was one of the go-to illustrations for what it meant to be a werewolf.
Yeah, as I was looking for stuff on him, I found so many, like into the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Anytime there was mention of a werewolf, it was like, yeah, like Peter Stumpp. That's a great example. Because these broadsheets and other works tended to be very heavily sensationalized, and the people creating them often copied from one another, it's hard to know what was really going on in and around Bedburg in the late 16th century. Peter Stumpp confessed to murders and to incest, but he also did so either under torture or under the threat of torture, and he did also confess to being able to turn into a wolf. So it's hard to take that confession just at face value. It is possible that he really was a serial killer who did murder numerous people, including children. It's also possible that the real culprit was someone else, or that at least some of those killings were really wolf attacks, or that the number of deaths was a lot smaller than what was described in these broadsheets and pamphlets.
We mentioned earlier that wolf attacks could be connected to warfare. The purported werewolf activities around Bedburg partially coincided with the Cologne War of 1583 to 1588, which was connected to the Reformation and Counter-Reformation and to wider conflicts in Europe. Back in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg had been negotiated to try to end conflict between Catholics and Lutherans in the Holy Roman Empire, which covered a lot of what is now Germany and adjacent areas. One provision of this agreement was that any ecclesiastical prince who converted to Protestantism had to give up his lands and his office. In 1582, the Archbishop Elector of Cologne converted to Calvinism and refused to surrender his land and title. In addition to violating the Peace of Augsburg, this threatened to give Protestants a majority in the College of Electors, so this was seen as a major issue. And it led to 5 years of fighting, with cities and towns besieged and plundered until the conflict finally ended in a Catholic victory. This fighting would have caused the kinds of conditions that were connected to spikes in wolf attacks, as well as the uncertainty, unrest, and fear that were connected to reports of witchcraft and lycanthropy.
The witch trials of the early modern period were, of course, also interconnected with religion. The same printing technology that was being used to produce all these broadsheets about witches and werewolves was also being used to print religious materials. That flourishing print culture of the era was a critical part of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and all the upheaval that were associated with them. And that upheaval was again part of what fed into these witch and werewolf panics.
The resulting witch and werewolf hunts also had explicitly religious underpinnings, beyond the idea that the devil was involved. As examples, Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, was the son of a Puritan clergyman, while Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, was one of the era's best-known treatises on witchcraft, and it was written by Catholic clergymen who had been inquisitors. The Inquisition's investigations into heresy and blasphemy also included investigations into alleged witchcraft.
Yeah, there was a lot going on. Like, we haven't even mentioned the second plague pandemic, which was also happening at the same time, also causing a lot of chaos and death and uncertainty. Long story short, this was a really gruesome story, but also a really gruesome story that was part of a centuries-long moral panic that played out alongside these multiple intense social and cultural and religious changes and strife. That's the werewolf story for today.
Do you have listener mail to go with it?
I do. I have listener mail that is from Noelle. They wrote and said, "Dear Holly and Tracy, in your recent awesome eponymous diseases episode, you read a listener mail asking for research tips in the age of AI and had an extended discussion about finding reputable sources. I know y'all love libraries, so I just wanted to note that depending on where a person lives, they may be able to access peer-reviewed articles through their local library. Libraries in some major cities, including New York City and Boston, offer access to databases like JSTOR. I know not everyone is going to want to read or be able to easily read something out of a medical journal, but research on history, for example, is a bit more accessible. And obviously, print books in libraries are safe from LLMs for now. I look forward to your show every week. For pet tax, I've attached a photo of my 7-year-old golden doodle tater tot, who still acts like a baby, and my 5-year-old cats, Mira, long hair, and Jojen, short hair. The former is our home's resident monarch, while the latter is a gremlin, but a cuddly one. Warmly, Noelle. Thank you, Noelle. These are some cute pictures.
Baby.
We have a dog in a vest, sitting on a beach, looking happy. Little curly hair dog. 3 animals, 2 cats and a dog, taking up the entirety of a bed. We have a kitty cat sitting in the bathtub. That happens at our house. Not as much anymore. Our cats used to like to play around the shower curtain and kind of duck back and forth out of there and pounce on each other. And a kitty cat in a basket. Thank you, Noelle, for these adorable pictures. Yeah, so the answer for information about finding reputable sources was kind of in the context of, like, you're on the internet, you're surrounded by things like TikTok and YouTube videos and Wikipedia and ChatGPT. Like, how do you find reputable information? A question about more formal academic research would have totally different answers. Boston Public Library does have JSTOR access. Anyone in Massachusetts can get a Boston Public Library digital library card. I don't actually use Boston Public Library for JSTOR because I have JSTOR access through other means. But yeah, even if the library doesn't have JSTOR specifically, most of the public libraries that I have been part of do have some EBSCO and Gale databases that have access to some other peer-reviewed journals. And I feel like that is the most useful when somebody is doing like a formal research project, like a school project, or if you are writing a novel and you want to make sure that your novel is historically accurate. That kind of peer-reviewed stuff might be good for informing that. It's not so much what I would recommend if, like, you're just trying to get quick answers to something on the internet, which is sort of how I interpreted the original question that we were responding to. And I also, at this point in my life, I don't actually advocate most people trying to read the journal articles about things like vaccine research and medical developments and stuff like that. Because a lot of those papers really do need background information and expertise to really understand and make sense of. And at this point, I've seen so many blog posts and news articles and whatnot, where folks have really misinterpreted things that are normal in the field of something like medical research, have like interpreted that as scary, just because of not having the background information and context to interpret things, and to understand like why things in research papers and big studies and things like that are framed in the way that they are. Every once in a while, I will see a bunch of like very scary headlines about like study finds alarming levels of arsenic in sugar snap peas. That's made up. And there will be just a whole big kind of panic in the media about the sugar snap peas. And then a couple of people who do have that background and the kind of research that the paper was reporting will read it and go, okay, that's really not what this is saying. That 300% increase is from a tiny amount, almost too small to be measured, to a larger amount that is still so small that it can almost not be measured. There's been a big, like, do your own research kind of vibe in a lot of things related to healthcare. And I think a lot of that has fed into misinformation about healthcare spread by people who, like, just don't have the background to be able to read and understand and correctly interpret those kinds of documents. So yeah, there are tons of resources available. Holly and I are big advocates of going to the library. A lot of libraries still have reference librarians of some sort who can help people find accurate information. Sadly, we already do have print books being entirely written through large language models that are making their way into print. That does seem to be more of an issue with people ordering things off of something like Amazon and getting something that was clearly written by a chatbot, more so than things that have been curated into a library collection, because typically the librarians who do that work know what to look out for.
Yeah, collection development is an entire field.
Yeah. We love the library. I love the access. I think I have 3 different library cards. It might be 4 now. There's the library card for the library network that I live in. There's Boston Public Library because I live in Massachusetts. There's another library network for the place that I lived previously, which is also one that, like, the card number is still active, but it's still accessible to other people who live in the area. And then a membership library that I pay for, and then the library where my husband works. I have wealth of library resources. I love libraries. So those are additional tips for other kinds of research. If you would like to write to us about this or any other podcast, we're at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. And you can subscribe to our show on the iHeartRadio app, anywhere else you like to get your podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.